The Nickel Boys, a novel by Colson Whitehead. Chapter 1. Elwood received the best gift of his life on Christmas Day, 1962, even if the ideas it put in his head were his undoing. Martin Luther King at Zion Hill was the only album he owned, and it never left the turntable. His grandmother Harriet had a few gospel records, which she only played when the world discovered a new, mean way to work on her. And Elwood wasn't allowed to listen to the Motown groups or popular songs like that on account of their licentious nature. The rest of his presents that year were clothes, a new red sweater, socks, and he certainly wore those out, but nothing endured such good and constant use as the record. Every scratch and pop it gathered over the months was a mark of his enlightenment, tracking each time he entered into a new understanding of the Reverend's words. The crackle of truth. They didn't have a TV set, but Dr. King's speeches were such a vivid chronicle, containing all that the Negro had been and all that he would be, that the record was almost as good as television, maybe even better, grander, like the towering screen at the Davis Drive-In, which he'd been to twice. Elwood saw it all. Africans persecuted by the white sin of slavery, Negroes humiliated and kept low by segregation, and that luminous image to come, when all those places closed to his race were opened. The speeches had been recorded all over, Detroit and Charlotte and Montgomery, connecting Elwood to the rights struggle across the country. One speech even made him feel like a member of the King family. Every kid had heard of Funtown, been there, or envied someone who had. In the third cut on side A, Dr. King spoke of how his daughter longed to visit the amusement park on Stewart Avenue in Atlanta. Yolanda begged her parents whenever she spotted the big sign from the expressway or the commercials came on TV. Dr. King had to tell her, in his low, sad rumble, about the segregation system that kept colored boys and girls on the other side of the fence. Explain the misguided thinking of some whites, not all whites, but enough whites, that gave it force and meaning. He counseled his daughter to resist the lure of hatred and bitterness, and assured her that even though you can't go to Funtown, I want you to know that you are as good as anybody who goes into Funtown. That was Elwood, as good as anyone. 230 miles south of Atlanta, in Tallahassee. Sometimes he saw a Funtown commercial while visiting his cousins in Georgia. Lurching rides and happy music, chipper white kids lining up for the Wild Mouse roller coaster, Dick's mini golf, strapped into the atomic rocket for a trip to the moon. A perfect report card, guaranteed free admission, the commercials said, if your teacher stamped a red mark on it. Elwood got all A's and kept his stack of evidence for the day they opened Funtown to all God's children, as Dr. King promised. I'll get in free every day for a month, easy, he told his grandmother, lying on the front room rug and tracing a threadbare patch with his thumb. His grandmother Harriet had rescued the rug from the alley behind the Richmond Hotel after the last renovation. The bureau in her room, the tiny table next to Elwood's bed, and 3 lamps were also Richmond cast-offs. Harriet had worked at the hotel since she was 14, when she had joined her mother on the cleaning staff. Once Elwood entered high school, the hotel manager, Mr. Parker, made it clear he'd hire him as a porter whenever he wanted, smart kid like him, and the white man was disappointed when the boy began working at Marconi's Tobacco and Cigars. Mr. Parker was always kind to the family, even after he had to fire Elwood's mother for stealing. Elwood liked the Richmond, and he liked Mr. Parker, but adding a 4th generation to the hotel's accounts made him uneasy in a way he found difficult to describe, even before the encyclopedias. When he was younger, he sat on a crate in the hotel kitchen after school, reading comic books and Hardy Boys while his grandmother straightened and scrubbed upstairs. With both his parents gone, she preferred to have her 9-year-old grandson nearby instead of alone in the house. Seeing Elwood with the kitchen men made her think those afternoons were a kind of school in their own right, that it was good for him to be around men. The cooks and waiters took the boy for a mascot, playing hide-and-seek with him and peddling creaky wisdom on various topics: the white man's ways, how to treat a good-time gal, strategies for hiding money around the house. Elwood didn't understand what the older men talked about most of the time, but he nodded gamely before returning to his adventure stories. After rushes, Elwood sometimes challenged the dishwashers to plate drying races, and they made a good-natured show of being disappointed by his superior skills. They liked seeing his smile and his odd delight at each win. Then the staff turned over. The new downtown hotels poached personnel. Cooks came and went. A few of the waiters didn't return after the kitchen reopened from flood damage. With the change in staff, Elwood's races changed from endearing novelty to mean-spirited hustle. The latest dishwashers were tipped off that the grandson of one of the cleaning girls did your work for you. If you told him it was a game, keep on the lookout. Who was this serious boy who loitered around while the rest of them busted their asses, getting little pats on the head from Mr. Parker like he was a damn puppy, nose in a comic book like he hadn't a care? The new men in the kitchen had different kinds of lessons to impart to a young mind, stuff they'd learned about the world. Elwood remained unaware that the premise of the competition had changed. When he issued a challenge, everybody in the kitchen tried not to smirk. Elwood was 12 when the encyclopedias appeared. One of the busboys dragged a stack of boxes into the kitchen and called for a powwow. Elwood squeezed in. It was a set of encyclopedias that a traveling salesman had left behind in one of the rooms upstairs. There were legends about the valuables that rich white people left in their rooms, but it was rare that this kind of plunder made it down to their domain. Barney the cook opened the top box and held up the leather-bound volume of Fisher's Universal Encyclopedia, A.R. to B. He handed it to Elwood, who was surprised at how heavy it was, a brick with pages edged in red. The boy flipped through, squinting at the tiny words Aegean, Archimedes, Argonaut, and had a picture of himself on the front room couch copying words he liked. Words that looked interesting on the page or that sounded interesting in his imagined pronunciations. Corey the busboy offered up his find. He didn't know how to read and had no immediate plans to learn. Elwood made his bid. Given the personality of the kitchen, it was hard to think of anyone else who'd want the encyclopedias. Then Pete, one of the new dishwashers, said he'd race him for it. Pete was a gawky Texan who'd started working 2 months prior. He was hired to bus tables, but after a few incidents, they moved him to the kitchen. He looked over his shoulder when he worked, as if worried about being watched, and didn't talk much, although his gravelly laughter made the other men in the kitchen direct their jokes toward him over time. Pete wiped his hands on his pants and said, "We got time before the dinner service, if you're up for it." The kitchen made a proper contest of it, the biggest yet. A stopwatch was produced and handed to Len, the gray-haired waiter who'd worked at the hotel for more than 20 years. He was meticulous about his black serving uniform and maintained that he was always the best-dressed man in the dining room, putting the white patrons to shame. With his attention to detail, he'd make a dedicated referee. 2 50-plate stacks were arranged after a proper soaking supervised by Elwood and Pete. 2 busboys acted as seconds for this duel, ready to hand over dry replacement rags when requested. A lookout stood at the kitchen door in case a manager happened by. While not prone to bravado, Elwood had never lost a dish-drying contest in 4 years and wore his confidence on his face. Pete had a concentrated air. Elwood didn't perceive the Texan as a threat, having outdried the man in prior competitions. Pete was, in general, a good loser. Len counted down from 10, and they began. Elwood stuck to the method he'd perfected over the years, mechanistic and gentle. He'd never let a wet plate slip or chipped one by setting it on the counter too quickly. As the kitchen men cheered them on, Pete's mounting stack of dried plates unnerved Elwood. The Texan had an edge on him, displaying new reserves. The onlookers made astonished noises. Elwood hurried, chasing after the image of the encyclopedias in their front room. Len said, "Stop." Elwood won by 1 plate. The men hollered and laughed and traded glances, whose meaning Elwood would interpret later. Harold, one of the busboys, slapped Elwood on the back. "You were made to wash dishes, slick." The kitchen laughed. Elwood returned volume R to B to its box. It was a fancy reward. "You earned it," Pete said. "I hope you get a lot of use out of them." Elwood asked the housekeeping manager to tell his grandmother he was going home. He couldn't wait to see the look on her face when she saw the encyclopedias on their bookshelves, elegant and distinguished. Hunched, he dragged the boxes to the bus stop on Tennessee. To see him from across the street, the serious young lad heaving his freight of the world's knowledge, was to witness a scene that might have been illustrated by Norman Rockwell if Elwood had had white skin. At home, he cleared Hardy Boys and Tom Swift's from the green bookcase in the front room and unpacked the boxes. He paused with Gar, curious to see how the smart men at the Fisher Company handled Galaxy. The pages were blank, all of them. Every volume in the first box was blank, except for the one he'd seen in the kitchen. He opened the other 2 boxes, his face getting hot. All the books were empty. When his grandmother came home, she shook her head and told him maybe they were defective or dummy copies the salesman showed to customers as samples so they could see how a full set would look in their homes. That night in bed, his thoughts ticked and hummed like a contraption. It occurred to him that the busboy, that all the men in the kitchen had known the books were empty, that they had put on a show. He kept the encyclopedias in the bookcase anyway. They looked impressive, even when the humidity peeled back the covers. The leather was fake too. The next afternoon in the kitchen was his last. Everyone paid too much attention to his face. Corey tested him with, "How'd you like those books?" and waited for a reaction. Over by the sink, Pete had a smile that looked as if it had been hacked into his jaw with a knife. They knew. His grandmother agreed that he was old enough to stay in the house by himself. Through high school, he went back and forth over the matter of whether the dishwashers had let him win all along. He'd been so proud of his ability, dumb and simple as it was. He never settled on one conclusion until he got to nickel, which made the truth of the contests unavoidable. Chapter 2 is saying goodbye to the kitchen meant saying goodbye to his separate game, the one he kept private. Whenever the dining room door swung open, he bet on whether there were Negro patrons out there. According to Brown v's Board of Education, schools had to desegregate. It was only a matter of time before all the invisible walls came down. The night the radio announced the Supreme Court's ruling, his grandmother shrieked as if someone had tossed hot soup in her lap. She caught herself and straightened her dress. "Jim Crow ain't going to just slink off," she said, "his wicked self." The morning after the decision, the sun rose and everything looked the same. Elwood asked his grandmother when Negroes were going to start staying at the Richmond, and she said, "It's one thing to tell someone to do what's right, and another thing for them to do it." She listed some of his behavior as proof, and Elwood nodded. Maybe so. Sooner or later, though, the door would swing wide to reveal a brown face, a dapper businessman in Tallahassee for business, or a fancy lady in town to see the sights, enjoying the fine-smelling fare the cooks put out. He was sure of it. The game began when he was 9, and 3 years later, the only colored people he saw in the dining room carried plates, or drinks, or a mop. He never stopped playing, up until his afternoons at the Richmond ended. Whether his opponent in this game was his own foolishness or the mulish constancy of the world was unclear. Mr. Parker was not the only one who saw a worthy employee in Elwood. White men were always extending offers of work to Elwood, recognizing his industrious nature and steady character, or at least recognizing that he carried himself differently than other colored boys his age and taking this for industry. Mr. Marconi, the proprietor of the tobacco shop on Macomb Street, had watched Elwood since he was a baby, squealing in a noisy carriage that was half rust. Elwood's mother was a slim woman with dark, tired eyes who never moved to quiet her child. She'd buy armfuls of movie magazines and vanish into the street, Elwood howling all the way. Mr. Marconi left his perch by the register as seldom as possible, squat and perspiring, with a low pompadour and a thin black mustache. He was inevitably disheveled by evening. The atmosphere at the front of the store was stringent, with his hair tonic, and he left an aromatic trail on hot afternoons. From his chair, Mr. Marconi observed Elwood grow older and lean toward his own son, veering away from the neighborhood boys who carried on and roughhoused in the aisles and slipped red hots into their dungarees when they thought Mr. Marconi wasn't looking. He saw everything, said nothing. Elwood belonged to the second generation of his Frenchtown customers. Mr. Marconi hung out his shingle a few months after the army base opened in '42. Negro soldiers took the bus up from Camp Gordon-Johnston or from Dale Marbury Army Airfield, raised hell in Frenchtown all weekend, then slumped back to train for war. He had relatives who opened businesses downtown and thrived, but a white man savvy to the economics of segregation could turn a real buck. Marconi's was a few doors down from the Bluebell Hotel. The Tip Top Bar and Marybell's Pool Hall were around the corner. He did a reliable trade in various tobaccos and tins of Romeo's prophylactics. Once the war ended, he moved the cigars to the back of the store, repainted the walls white, and added magazine racks, penny candy, and a soda cooler, which did much to improve the place's reputation. He hired help. He didn't need an employee, but his wife liked telling people that he had an employee, and he imagined it made the store more approachable to a genteel segment of Black Frenchtown. Elwood was 13 when Vincent, the tobacco shop's longtime stock boy, signed up for the army. Vincent hadn't been the most attentive employee, but he was prompt and well-groomed, two qualities that Mr. Marconi valued in others, if not in himself. On Vincent's last day, Elwood dawdled at the comics rack, as he did most afternoons. He had a curious habit where he read every comic front to back before he bought it, and he bought every one he touched. Mr. Marconi asked why go through all that if he was going to buy them whether they were good or not. And Elwood said, "Just making sure." The shopkeeper asked him if he needed a job. Elwood closed the copy of Journey into Mystery and said he'd have to ask his grandmother. Harriet had a long list of rules for what was acceptable and what was not. And sometimes the only way for Elwood to know how it all worked was to make a mistake. He waited until after dinner. Once they'd finished the fried catfish and the sour greens, and his grandmother rose to clear. In this case, she held no hidden reservations, despite the fact that her Uncle Abe had smoked cigars and look what happened to him. Despite Macomb Street's history as a laboratory of vice, and despite the fact she'd turned her mistreatment by an Italian sales clerk decades ago into a cherished grudge. "They're probably not related," she said, wiping her hands. "Or if they are, distant cousins." She let Elwood work at the store, after school, and on weekends, taking half his paycheck at the end of the week for the household and half for college. He'd mentioned going to college the summer prior, casually, with no inkling of the momentousness of his words. Brown versus Board of Education was an unlikely turn, but one of Harriet's family, aspiring to higher education, was an actual miracle. Any misgivings over the tobacco shop collapsed before such a notion. Elwood tidied the newspapers and comic books in the wire racks, wiped dust off the less popular sweets, and made sure that the cigar boxes were arranged according to Marconi's theories about packaging and how it excited the happy part of the human brain. He still hung around the comics, reading them gingerly as if handling dynamite, but the news magazines exerted a gravity. He fell under the luxurious sway of Life magazine. A big white truck dropped off a stack of Life every Thursday. Elwood came to learn the sound of its brakes. Once he sorted the returns and displayed the new arrivals, he hunkered on the stepladder to follow the magazine's latest excursions into unreckoned corners of America. He knew Frenchtown's piece of the Negro's struggle, where his neighborhood ended and white law took over. Life's photo essays conveyed him to the front lines, to bus boycotts in Baton Rouge, to counter sit-ins in Greensboro, where young people, not much older than him, took up the movement. They were beaten with metal bars, blasted by fire hoses, spat on by white housewives with angry faces, and frozen by the camera in tableaus of noble resistance. The tiny details were a wonder. How the young men's ties remained straight black arrows in the whirl of violence. How the curves of the young women's perfect hairdos floated against the squares of their protest signs. Glamorous somehow, even when the blood flowed down their faces. Young knights taking the fight to dragons. Elwood was slight-shouldered, skinny as a pigeon, and he worried about the safety of his glasses, which were expensive and in his dreams broken in two by nightsticks, tire irons, or baseball bats. But he wanted to enlist. He had no choice. Flipping pages during lulls. Elwood's shifts at Marconi's provided models for the man he wished to become, and separated him from the type of Frenchtown boy he was not. His grandmother had long steered him from hanging out with the local kids, whom she regarded as shiftless, clambering into rambunction. The tobacco shop, like the hotel kitchen, was a safe preserve. Harriet raised him strict, everyone knew, and the other parents on their stretch of Brevard Street helped keep Elwood apart by holding him up as an example. When the boys he used to play cowboys and Indians with chased him down the street every once in a while or threw rocks at him, it was less out of mischief than resentment. People from his block stopped in Marconi's all the time, and his worlds overlapped. One afternoon, the bell above the door jangled, and Mrs. Thomas walked in. "Hello, Mrs. Thomas," Elwood said. "There's some Code Orange in there." "I think I just might, Elle," she said. A connoisseur of the latest styles, Mrs. Thomas was dressed this afternoon in a homemade yellow polka-dot dress she'd copied from a magazine profile of Audrey Hepburn. She was quite aware that few women in the neighborhood could have worn it with such confidence, and when she stood still, it was hard to escape the suspicion that she was posing, waiting for the pop of flashbulbs. Mrs. Thomas had been Evelyn Curtis's best friend growing up. One of Elwood's earliest memories was of sitting on his mother's lap on a hot day while they played gin. He squirmed to see his mother's cards, and she told him not to fuss. It was too hot out. When she got up to visit the outhouse, Mrs. Thomas snuck him sips of her orange soda. His orange tongue gave them away, and Evelyn half-heartedly scolded them while they giggled. Elwood kept that day close. Mrs. Thomas opened her purse to pay for her 2 sodas and this week's jet. "You keeping up with that schoolwork?" "Yes, ma'am." "I don't work the boy too hard," Mr. Marconi said. Mrs. Thomas said. Her tone was suspect. Frenchtown ladies remembered the tobacco store from its disreputable days and considered the Italian an accomplice to domestic miseries. "You keep doing what you're supposed to, Elle." She took her change, and Elwood watched her leave. His mother had left both of them. It was possible she sent her friend postcards from this or that place, even if she forgot to write him. One day, Mrs. Thomas might share some news. Mr. Marconi carried Jet, of course, and Ebony. Elwood got him to pick up the Crisis and the Chicago Defender, and other black newspapers. His grandmother and her friends subscribed, and he thought it strange that the store didn't sell them. "You're right," Mr. Marconi said. He pinched his lip. "I think we used to carry it. I don't know what happened." "Great," Elwood said. Long after Mr. Marconi had stopped minding his regular buying habits, Elwood remembered what brought each person into the store. His predecessor, Vincent, had occasionally livened up the place with a dirty joke, but it couldn't be said that he had initiative. Elwood possessed it in spades, reminding Mr. Marconi which tobacco vendor had shorted them on the last delivery and which candy to quit restocking. Mr. Marconi struggled to tell the colored ladies of Frenchtown apart. All of them wore a scowl when they saw him, and Elwood made a competent ambassador. He'd stare at the boy when he was lost in his magazines and try to figure what made him tick. His grandmother was firm. That was clear. The boy was intelligent and hard-working, and a credit to his race. But Elwood could be thick-witted when it came to the simplest things. He didn't know when to stand back and let things be, like the business with the black eye. Kids swiped candy. It didn't matter what color their skin was. Mr. Marconi himself, in his untethered youth, had engineered all sorts of foolishness. You lose a percentage here and there, but that was in the overhead. Kids steal a candy bar today, but they and their friends spend their money in the store for years. Them and their parents chase them out into the street over some little thing. Word gets around, especially in a neighborhood like this, where everybody's in everybody's business, and then the parents stop coming in because they're embarrassed. Letting the kids steal was almost an investment, the way he looked at it. Elwood drifted to a different perspective during his time in the store. Before he worked at Marconi's, his friends gloated over their candy heists, cackling and blowing insolent pink bubbles of bazooka once they got a good distance from the store. Elwood didn't join in, but he'd never had feelings on it. When Mr. Marconi hired him, his boss explained his attitude towards sticky fingers, along with where they kept the mop and what days to expect the big deliveries. Over the months, Elwood saw sweets disappear into boys' pockets, boys he knew, maybe with a wink to Elwood if they caught his eye. For a year, Elwood said nothing, but the day Larry and Willie grabbed the lemon candies when Mr. Marconi bent behind the counter, he couldn't restrain himself. "Put it back." The boys stiffened. Larry and Willie had known Elwood their whole lives, played marbles and tag with him when they were small, although that ended when Larry started a fire in the vacant lot on Dade Street, and Willie got left back twice. Harriet struck them from the list of allowable companions. Their 3 families went back in Frenchtown for generations. Larry's grandmother was in a church group with Harriet, and Willie's father had been a childhood buddy of Elwood's father, Percy. They shipped off to the army together. Willie's father spent every day on his porch in his wheelchair, smoking a pipe, and he waved whenever Elwood passed. Put it back, Elwood said. Mr. Marconi tilted his head. That's enough. The boys returned the candy and left the store, smoldering. They knew Elwood's route, sometimes jeered at him for being a goody two-shoes when he biked past Larry's window on his way home. That night, they jumped him. It was just getting dark, and the smell of magnolias mingled with the tang of fried pork. They slammed him and his bike into the new asphalt the county had laid down that winter. The boys tore his sweater, threw his glasses into the street. As they beat him, Larry asked Elwood if he had any damned sense. Willie declared that he needed to be taught a lesson and proceeded to do so. Elwood got a few licks in here and there, not much to talk about. He didn't cry. When he came upon two little kids fighting on his block, Elwood was the kind to intervene and cool things down. Now he was getting his. An old man from across the street broke it up and asked Elwood if he wanted to clean himself or have a glass of water. Elwood declined. The chain on his bike was popped, and he walked it home. Harriet didn't press him when she asked about his eye. He shook his head. By morning, the livid bump underneath was a bubble of blood. Larry had a point, Elwood had to admit. From time to time it appeared that he had no goddamned sense. He couldn't explain it, even to himself, until, at Zion Hill, gave him a language. We must believe in our souls, that we are somebody, that we are significant, that we are worthful, and we must walk the streets of life every day with this sense of dignity and this sense of somebody-ness. The record went around and around, like an argument that always returned to its unassailable premise, and Dr. King's words filled the front room of the shotgun house. Elwood bent to a code. Doctor. King gave that code shape, articulation, and meaning. There are big forces that want to keep the Negro down, like Jim Crow, and there are small forces that want to keep you down, like other people, and in the face of all those things, the big ones and the smaller ones, you have to stand up straight and maintain your sense of who you are. The encyclopedias are empty. There are people who trick you and deliver emptiness with a smile, while others rob you of your self-respect. You need to remember who you are. This sense of dignity, the way the man said it, crackle and all, an inalienable strength, even when consequences lay in wait on dark street corners on your way home. They beat him up and tore his clothes and didn't understand why he wanted to protect a white man. How to tell them that their transgressions against Mr. Marconi were insults to Elwood himself, whether it was a sucker candy or a comic book. Not because any attack on his brother was an attack on himself, like they said in church, but because for him, to do nothing was to undermine his own dignity. No matter that Mr. Marconi had told him he didn't care, no matter that Elwood had never said a word to his friends when they stole in his presence. It didn't make no sense until it made the only sense. That was Elwood, as good as anyone. On the day he was arrested, just before the deputy appeared, an advertisement for Funtown came on the radio. He hummed along. He remembered that Yolanda King was 6 years old when her father told her the truth about the amusement park and the white order that kept her outside the fence, looking in, always looking into that other world. Elwood was 6 when his parents took off, and he thought, that's another thing, tying him to her, because that's when he woke to the world. Chapter 3. On the first day of the school year, the students of Lincoln High School received their new second-hand textbooks from the white high school across the way. Knowing where the textbooks were headed, the white students left inscriptions for the next owners. Choke, nigger, you smell, eat shit. September was a tutorial in the latest epithets of Tallahassee's white youth, which, like hemlines and haircuts, varied year to year. It was humiliating to open a biology book, turn to the page on the digestive system, and be confronted with drop-dead nigger. But as the school year went on, the students of Lincoln High School stopped noticing the curses and impolite suggestions. How to get through the day if every indignity capsized you in a ditch. One learned to focus one's attention. Mr. Hill started working at the high school when Elwood entered his junior year. He greeted Elwood and the rest of the history class and wrote his name on the blackboard. Then Mr. Hill handed out black markers and told his students that the first order of business was to strike out all the bad words in the textbooks. "That always burned me up," he said, "seeing that stuff. You all are trying to get an education. No need to get caught up with what those fools say." Like the rest of the class, Elwood went slow at first. They looked at the textbooks and then at the teacher. Then they dug in with their markers. Elwood got giddy. His heart sped. This escapade. Why hadn't anyone told them to do this before? "Make sure you don't miss anything," Mr. Hill said. "You know those white kids are wily." While the students struck out the curses and cusses, he told them about himself. He was new to Tallahassee, having just finished his studies at a teaching college in Montgomery. He'd first visited Florida the previous summer, when he stepped off a bus from Washington, D.C., in Tallahassee as a Freedom Rider. He had marched, installed himself at forbidden lunch counters, and waited for service. "I got a lot of coursework done," he said, sitting there waiting for my cup of coffee. Sheriffs threw him in jail for breach of peace. He was almost bored as he shared these stories, as if what he had done was the most natural thing in the world. Elwood wondered if he'd seen him, in the pages of Life or The Defender, arm in arm with the great movement leaders, or in the background with the anonymous ones, standing tall and proud. Mr. Hill maintained a broad collection of bow ties, polka dot, bright red, banana yellow. His wide, kind face was somehow made kinder by the crescent scar over his right eye, where a white man had slugged him with a tire iron. "Nashville," he said when someone asked one afternoon, and he bit into his pear. The class focused on U.S. history since the Civil War, but at every opportunity, Mr. Hill guided them to the present, linking what had happened 100 years ago to their current lives. They'd set off down one road at the beginning of class, and it always led back to their doorsteps. Mr. Hill caught on that Elwood had a fascination with the right struggle and gave the boy a wry smile when he chimed in. The rest of the faculty of Lincoln High School had long held the boy in high esteem, grateful for his cool temperament. Those who'd taught his parents years ago had a hard time squaring him. He may have carried his father's name, but there was nothing in the boy of Percy's feral charm or of Evelyn's unnerving gloom. Grateful was the teacher rescued by Elwood's contributions when the classroom fell drowsy with the afternoon heat, and he offered up Archimedes or Amsterdam at the key moment. The boy had one usable volume of Fisher's Universal Encyclopedia, so he used it. What else could he do? Better than nothing. Skipping around, wearing it down, revisiting his favorite parts as if it were one of his adventure tales. As a story, the encyclopedia was disjointed and incomplete, but still exciting in its own right. Elwood filled his notebook with the good parts, definitions, and etymology. Later, he'd find this scrap rummaging pathetic. He had been the natural choice at the end of his freshman year when they needed a new lead for the annual Emancipation Day play. Playing Thomas Jackson, the man who informs the Tallahassee slaves that they are free, was training for the version of himself who lived up the road. Elwood invested the character with the same earnestness he brought to all his responsibilities. In the play, Thomas Jackson was a cutter on a sugar plantation who ran away to join the Union Army at the start of the war, returning home a statesman. Every year, Elwood concocted new inflections and gestures, the speeches losing their stiffness as his own convictions enlivened the portrait. It is my pleasure to inform you, fine gentlemen and ladies, that the time has come to throw off the yoke of slavery and take our places as true Americans, at long last. The play's author, a teacher of biology, had attempted to summon the magic of her one trip to Broadway years before. In the 3 years Elwood played the role, the one constant was his nervousness at the climax when Jackson had to kiss his best girl on the cheek. They were to be married and, it was implied, live a happy and fertile life in the new Tallahassee. Whether Marie-Jean was played by Anne, with her freckles and sweet moon face, or by Beatrice, whose buck teeth hooked into her lower lip, or in his final performance by Gloria Taylor, a foot taller and sending him to the tips of his toes, a knot of anxiety tautened in his chest, and he got dizzy. All the hours in Marconi's library had rehearsed him for heavy speeches, but left him ill-prepared for performances with the brown beauties of Lincoln High, on the stage and off. The movement he read and fantasized about was far off. Then it crept closer. Frenchtown had its protests, but Elwood was too young to join in. He was 10 years old when the 2 girls from Florida A&M University proposed the bus boycott. His grandmother initially didn't understand why they wanted to bring all that fuss to their city, but after a few days, she was carpooling to the hotel like everyone else. "Everybody in Leon County has gone crazy," she said, "including me." That winter, the city finally integrated the buses, and she got on and saw a colored driver behind the wheel, sat where she wanted. 4 years later, when the students got it in their mind to sit down at the lunch counter at Woolworth's, Elwood remembered his grandmother cackling with approval. She even gave 50 cents to support their legal defense after the sheriff jailed them. When the demonstrations trailed off, she continued to boycott downtown stores, although it was not clear how much of that was solidarity or her own protest against high prices. In the spring of '63, word spread that the college kids were going to picket the Florida Theater to open its seats to Negroes. Elwood had good reason to think that Harriet would be proud of him for stepping up. He was incorrect. Harriet Johnson was a slight hummingbird of a woman who conducted herself in everything with furious purpose. If something was worth doing, working, eating, talking to another person, it was worth doing seriously or not at all. She kept a sugarcane machete under her pillow for intruders, and it was difficult for Elwood to think that the old woman was afraid of anything. But fear was her fuel. Yes, Harriet had joined the bus boycott. She had to. She couldn't be the only woman in Frenchtown to take public transportation. But she trembled each time Slim Harrison pulled up in his '57 Cadillac, and she squeezed into the back with the other downtown-bound ladies. When the sit-ins started, she was grateful that no one expected a public gesture on her part. Sit-ins were a young person's game, and she didn't have the heart. Act above your station, and you will pay. Whether it was God angry at her for taking more than her portion, or the white man teaching her not to ask for more crumbs than he wanted to give, Harriet would pay. Her father had paid for not stepping out of the way of a white lady on Tennessee Avenue. Her husband, Monty, paid when he stepped up. Elwood's father, Percy, got too many ideas when he joined the army, so that when he came back, there was no room in Tallahassee for everything in his head. Now, Elwood. She'd bought that Martin Luther King record from a salesman outside the Richmond for a dime, and it was the damnedest 10 cents she'd ever handed over. That record was nothing but ideas, Hard work was a fundamental virtue, for hard work didn't allow time for marches or sit-ins. Elwood would not make a commotion of himself by messing with that movie theatre nonsense, she said. You have made an agreement with Mr. Marconi to work in his store after school. If your boss can't depend on you, you won't be able to keep a job. Duty might protect him, as it had protected her. A cricket under the house made a racket. Should have been paying rent. It had been flopping with them for so long. Elwood looked up from his science book and said, "Okay." The next afternoon, he asked Mr. Marconi for a day off. Elwood had been out sick 2 days, but apart from that, and some visits to see family, he hadn't missed work in those 3 years at the store. Mr. Marconi said sure, didn't even look up from his racing form. Elwood dressed in the dark slacks from last year's Emancipation Day play. He'd grown a few inches, so he let them out, and they showed the barest sliver of his white socks. A new emerald tie clip held his black tie in place, and the knot only took 6 attempts. His shoes glinted with polish. He looked the part, even if he still worried for his glasses, if the police brought out nightsticks, if the whites carried iron pipes and baseball bats. He waved off the bloody images from newspapers and magazines and tucked in his shirt. Elwood heard the chants when he reached the SO station on Monroe. What do we want? Freedom. When do we want it? Now. The A&M students marched in snaky loops in front of the Florida, hoisting signs and rotating slogans under the marquee. The theater was showing The Ugly American. If you had 75 cents and the right skin color, you could see Marlon Brando. The sheriff and his deputies had installed themselves on the sidewalk in dark sunglasses, arms crossed. A group of whites jeered and taunted behind the policemen, and more white men trotted down the street to join them. Elwood kept his eyes down as he walked around the mob and slipped into the protest line behind an older girl in a striped sweater. She grinned at him and nodded as if she had been waiting for him. He calmed once he joined the human chain and mouthed the words with the others. Equal treatment under the law. Where was his sign? In his concentration on looking the part, he'd forgotten his props. He couldn't have matched the older kid's perfect stencil work. They'd had practice. Nonviolence is our watchword. We shall win by love. A short boy with a shaved head waved one that said, "Are you the ugly American?" in a sea of cartoony question marks. Someone grabbed Elwood's shoulder. He thought he'd see a monkey wrench bearing down, but it was Mr. Hill. His history teacher invited him into a group of Lincoln seniors. Bill Tuddy and Alvin Tate, 2 guys from varsity basketball, shook his hand. They'd never acknowledged him before. He'd kept his movement dreams so close that it never occurred to him that others in his school shared his need to stand up. The next month, the sheriff arrested more than 200 protesters and charged them with contempt, snatching collars in a royal of tear gas. But this first march went off without incident. By then, the FAMU students would be joined by those from Melvin Griggs Technical, white kids from the University of Florida and Florida State, skilled hands from the Congress of Racial Equality. This day, old and young white men shouted at them, but it was nothing Elwood hadn't heard shouted from cars when biking down the street. One of the red-faced white boys looked like Cameron Parker, the son of the Richmond's manager, and the next circuit confirmed it. They'd traded comic books a few years ago in the alley behind the hotel. Cameron didn't recognize him. A flashbulb exploded in his face and Elwood started, but the photographer was from the Register, which his grandmother refused to read because their race coverage was so slanted. A college girl in a tight blue sweater handed him a sign that said, "I am a man." And when the protest moved to the State Theater, He held it over his head and lent his voice to the proud chorus. The state was playing The Day Mars Invaded Earth, and that night he thought he'd traveled 100,000 miles in one day. 3 days later, Harriet confronted him. One of her circle had seen him, and that's how long it took for the news to get back to her. It had been years since she spanked him with a belt, and now he was much too big, so she resorted to an old Johnson family recipe for the silent treatment, one that dated back to Reconstruction and achieved a complete sense of erasure in its target. She instituted a ban on the record player and, recognizing the resiliency of this younger generation of colored youth, moved it into her bedroom and weighed it down with bricks. They both suffered in the quiet. After a week, things in the house were back to their routine, but Elwood was changed, closer. At the demonstration, he had felt somehow closer to himself. For a moment, out there in the sun, it was enough to feed his dreams. Once he got to college and out of their little shotgun house on Brevard, he'd start his life. Take girls to the movies. He was done stymieing himself on that front, and figure out a course of study. Find his place in the busy line of young dreamers who dedicated themselves to Negro uplift. That last summer in Tallahassee passed quickly. Mr. Hill gave him a copy of James Baldwin's Notes of a Native Son on the last day of school, and his mind churned. Negroes are Americans, and their destiny is the country's destiny. He hadn't marched on the Florida theater in defense of his rights or those of the black race of which he was a part. He had marched for everyone's rights, even those who shouted him down. My struggle is your struggle. Your burden is my burden. But how to tell people? He stayed up late writing letters on the racial question to the Tallahassee Register, which did not run them, and the Chicago Defender, which printed one. We ask of the older generation, will you pick up our challenge? Bashful, he didn't tell anyone and wrote under a pseudonym, Archer Montgomery. It sounded stuffy and smart, and he didn't realize he'd used his grandfather's name until he saw it in black and white newsprint. In June, Mr. Marconi became a grandfather, a milestone that exposed new facets in the Italian. He turned the shop into a showcase for avuncular enthusiasm. The long silences gave way to lessons from his immigrant struggles and eccentric business advice. He took to closing the shop an hour early to visit his granddaughter and paid Elwood for a full shift. When this happened, Elwood strolled over to the basketball courts to see if anyone was playing. He only ever watched, but his excursion to the protests had made him less shy, and he made a few friends on the sidelines, dudes from 2 streets over whom he'd seen for years but never talked to. Other times, he might go downtown with Peter Coombs, a neighborhood boy Harriet approved of on account that he played violin and shared a bookish bent with her grandson. If Peter didn't have practice, they wandered the record stores and furtively checked out the covers of LPs they were forbidden to buy. What's diner sound? Peter asked. A new style of music, a different way of hearing. They were confounded. Once in a while, on hot afternoons, girls from FAMU stopped in the store for a soda. Someone from the Florida demonstration. Elwood asked for news on the protests, and they'd brighten at the connection and pretend to recognize him. More than one told him that they assumed he was in college. He took their observations as compliments, ornaments on his daydreams about leaving home. Optimism made Elwood as malleable as the cheap taffy below the register. He was primed when Mr. Hill appeared in the store that July and made his suggestion. Elwood didn't recognize him at first. No colorful bow tie, an orange plaid shirt open to show his undershirt, hip sunglasses. Mr. Hill looked like someone who hadn't thought about work for months, not weeks. He greeted his former student with the lazy ease of someone who had the whole summer off. For the first summer in a while, he wasn't traveling, he told Elwood. "There's plenty here to keep me occupied," he said, nodding toward the sidewalk. A young woman in a floppy straw hat waited for him, her thin hand shading her eyes from the sunlight. Elwood asked Mr. Hill if he needed anything. "I came here to see you, Elwood," he said. "A friend of mine told me about an opportunity, and I thought of you right off the bat." Mr. Hill had a comrade from the Freedom Riders, a college professor who'd landed a job at Melvin Griggs Technical, the colored college just south of Tallahassee, teaching English and American literature. Just finished his third year. The school had been poorly managed for some time. The new president of the college was turning things around. The courses at Melvin Griggs had been open to high-achieving high school students for some time, but none of the local families knew about it. The president put Mr. Hill's friend on it, and he reached out. Perhaps there were a few exceptional kids at Lincoln who might be interested. Elwood tightened his hands on the broom. "That sounds great, but I don't know if we have the money for classes like that." Later, he'd shake his head. College classes were exactly what he'd been saving up for. What did it matter if he took them while still at Lincoln? "That's the thing, Elwood. They're free. This fall at least, so they can get the word out in the community. I'll have to ask my grandmother." "You do that, Elwood," Mr. Hill said, "and I can talk to her too." He put his hand on Elwood's shoulder. "The main thing is, it'd be perfect for a young man like you. You're the type of student they came up with this for." Later that afternoon, as he chased a fat, buzzing fly around the store, Elwood thought there probably weren't a lot of white kids in Tallahassee who studied at the college level. He who gets behind in a race must forever remain behind or run faster than the man in front. Harriet expressed no misgivings over Mr. Hill's offer. The word free was a master switch. After that, Elwood's summer moved as slow as a mud turtle. Because Mr. Hill's friend taught English, he thought he had to sign up for a literature course, but even when he found out he could take anything he wanted, he stuck with it. The survey course on British writers wasn't practical, as his grandmother pointed out, but that was its charm. The more he thought about it, he had been exceedingly practical for a long time. Perhaps the textbooks at the college might be new, unscarred, nothing to cross out. It was possible. The day before Elwood's first college class, Mr. Marconi summoned him to the cash register. Elwood had to miss his Thursday shifts in order to attend. He assumed his boss wanted to make sure things were in order for his absence. The Italian cleared his throat and pushed a velvet case to him. "For your education," he said. It was a midnight blue fountain pen with brass trim. A nice gift, even if Mr. Marconi got a discount because the stationers were a steady client. They shook hands in a manly fashion. Harriet wished him good luck. She checked his school outfit every morning to make sure he was presentable, but apart from plucking the occasional piece of lint, never made any corrections. This day was no different. "You look smart, El," she said. She kissed him on the cheek before heading to the bus stop, hunching her shoulders in the way she did when she was trying not to cry in front of him. Elwood had plenty of time after school to get to the college, but he was so eager to see Melvin Griggs for the first time that he set out early. 2 rivets in his bike chain broke the night he got that black eye, and ever since, it tended to snap when he took it out for long rides. He'd stick out his thumb or walk the 7 miles, step through the gates and explore the campus, get lost in all those buildings, or just sit on a bench off the quadrangle and breathe it in. He waited at the corner of Old Bainbridge for a colored driver who headed for the state road. 2 pickups passed him by, And then a brilliant green 61 Plymouth Fury slowed, low and finned like a giant catfish. The driver leaned over and opened the passenger door. "Going south," he said. The green and white vinyl seats squeaked when Elwood slid inside. "Rodney," the man said. Rodney had a sprawling but solid physique, like a Negro version of Edward G. Robinson. His grey and purple pinstripe suit completed the costume. When Rodney shook his hand, the rings on his fingers bit and made Elwood wince. Elwood. He put his satchel between his legs and looked over the space-age dashboard of the Plymouth, all the push buttons sticking out of the silver detailing. They headed south toward County Road 636. Rodney tapped vainly at the radio. "This always gives me trouble. You try it." Elwood stabbed the buttons and found an R&B station. He almost turned the channel, but Harriet wasn't here to cluck over the double meanings in the lyrics, her explanations of which always left him mystified and dubious. He let the station sit. It was a doo-wop group. Rodney wore the same hair tonic as Mr. Marconi. The air in the car was acrid and heavy with the stuff. Even on his day off, he couldn't rid himself of it. Rodney was on his way back from seeing his mother, who lived in Valdosta. He said he hadn't heard of Melvin Griggs before, putting a dent in Elwood's pride over his big day. "College," Rodney said. He whistled through his teeth. "I started working in a chair factory when I was 14, he added. "I have a job in a tobacco store," Elwood said. "I'm sure you do," Rodney said. The disc jockey rattled off the information for the Sunday swap meet. A commercial for Funtown came on, and Elwood hummed along. "What's this?" Rodney said. He exhaled loudly and cursed, ran his hand over his conch. The red light of the prow car spun in the rearview mirror. They were in the country, and there were no other cars. Rodney muttered and pulled over. Elwood put his satchel in his lap, and Rodney told him to keep cool. The white deputy parked a few yards behind them. He put his left hand on his holster and walked up. He took off his sunglasses and put them in his chest pocket. Rodney said, "You don't know me, do you?" "No," Elwood said. "I'll tell him that." The deputy had his gun out now. "First thing I thought when they said to keep an eye out for a Plymouth," he said. "Only a niggard'd steal that." Part 2, Chapter 4. After the judge ordered him to nickel, Elwood had 3 last nights at home. The state car arrived at 7 o'clock Tuesday morning. The officer of the court was a good old boy with a meaty backwoods beard and a hungover wobble to his step. He'd outgrown his shirt, and the pressure against the buttons made him look upholstered. But he was a white man with a pistol, so despite his dishevelment, he sent a vibration. Along the street, men watched from porches and smoked and gripped the railings as if afraid of falling overboard. The neighbors peeked through their windows for a view, connecting the scene to events from years before, when a boy or a man was taken away, and he was not someone who lived across the street, but kin, brother, son. The officer tossed a toothpick around in his mouth when he talked, which was not often. He handcuffed Elwood to a metal bar that ran behind the front seat and didn't speak for 275 miles. They got down to Tampa, and 5 minutes later, the officer was in a fight with the clerk at the jail. There had been a mistake. All 3 boys were headed for the Nickel Academy, and the colored boy was supposed to be picked up last, not first. Tallahassee was only an hour away from the school after all. Didn't he think it strange that he was driving the boy up and down the state like a yo-yo? The clerk asked. At this point, his face was red. "I just read what's on the paper," the officer said. "It's alphabetical," the clerk said. Elwood rubbed at the mark, the cuffs cut into his wrists, and could have sworn the bench in the waiting room was a church pew. It was the same shape. Half an hour later, They were on the road again. Franklin T. and Bill Y., alphabetically distant and temperamentally even farther. Elwood took the two white boys next to him for rough characters from the first scowl. Franklin T. had the most freckled face he'd ever seen. With a deep suntan and crew-cut red hair, he had a downcast look, head sunk, staring at his toes, but when he lifted his eyes to other people, they were invariably vesseled with fury. Bill Y's eyes, for their part, had been punched black, purple, and lurid. His lips were puffed and scabbed. The brown, pear-shaped birthmark on his right cheek added another hue to his mottled face. He snorted when he got a look at Elwood, and whenever their legs touched on the drive, Bill pulled back as if he'd leaned against a hot chimney stove. Whatever their life stories, whatever they'd done to get sent to Nickel, the boys were chained together in the same fashion and headed to the same destination. Franklin and Bill exchanged notes after a while. This was Franklin's second visit to Nickel. The first time was for being recalcitrant. He was back for truancy. He got a licking for eyeballing the wife of one of the house fathers, but other than that, the place was decent, he supposed. Away from his stepfather, at least. Bill was being raised by his sister and fell in with a bunch of bad apples, as the judge put it. They broke the front window of a pharmacy, but Bill got off easy. He was going to Nickel because he was only 14, while the rest were heading up to Piedmont. The officer told the white boys that they were sitting with a car thief, and Bill laughed. "Oh, I used to go joyriding all the time," he said. "They should have pinched me for that, not some dumb window." Outside of Gainesville, they drifted off the interstate. The officer pulled over to let everyone piss and gave them mustard sandwiches. He didn't cuff them when they got back in the car. The officer said he knew they weren't going to run. He skirted Tallahassee, taking the back road around it like the place didn't exist anymore. "I don't even recognize the trees," Elwood told himself when they got to Jackson County, feeling low. He got a look at the school and thought maybe Franklin was right. Nickel wasn't that bad. He expected tall stone walls and barbed wire, but there were no walls at all. The campus was kept up meticulously, a bounty of lush green, dotted with 2- and 3-story buildings of red brick. The cedar trees and beeches cut out portions of shade, tall and ancient. It was the nicest-looking property Elwood had ever seen. A real school, a good one, not the forbidding reformatory he'd conjured the last few weeks. In a sad joke, it intersected with his visions of Melvin Griggs Technical, minus a few statues and columns. They drove up the long road to the main administration building, and Elwood caught sight of a football field where some boys scrimmaged and yelped. In his head, he'd seen kids attached to balls and chains, something out of cartoons, but these fellows were having a swell time out there, thundering around the grass. "All right," Bill said, pleased. Elwood was not the only one reassured. The officer said, "Don't get smart. If the housemen don't run you down, and the swamp don't suck you up." "They call in those dogs from the state penitentiary, Appalachia," Franklin said. "You get along, and you'll get along," the officer said. Inside the building, the officer waved down a secretary who took them into a yellow room whose walls were lined with wooden filing cabinets. The chairs were in classroom rows, and the boys picked spots far apart from one another. Elwood took a place in the front, per his custom. They all sat up when Superintendent Spencer knocked the door open. Maynard Spencer was a white man in his late 50s, bits of silver in his cropped black hair. A real crack of dawner, as Harriet used to say, who moved with a deliberate air as if he rehearsed everything in front of a mirror. He had a narrow raccoon face that drew Elwood's attention to his tiny nose and dark circles under his eyes and thick bristly eyebrows. Spencer was fastidious with his dark blue nickel uniform. Every crease in his clothes looked sharp enough to cut, as if he were a living blade. Spencer nodded at Franklin, who grabbed the corners of his desk. The supervisor suppressed a smile, as if he'd known the boy would be back. He leaned against the blackboard and crossed his arms. "You got here late in the day," he said, "so I won't go on too long. Everybody's here because they haven't figured out how to be around decent people. That's okay. This is a school, and we're teachers. We're going to teach you how to do things like everyone else." "I know you heard all this before, Franklin, but it didn't take, obviously. Maybe this time it will. Right now, all of you are grubs. We have 4 ranks of behavior here. Start as a grub, work your way up to explorer, then pioneer, and finally, ace. Earn merits for acting right, and you move on up the ladder. You work on achieving the highest rank of ace, and then you graduate and go home to your families." He paused. "If they'll have you, but that's between y'all. An ace," he said, "listens to the houseman and his housefather, does his work without shirking and malingering, and applies himself to his studies. An ace does not roughhouse, he does not cuss, he does not blaspheme or carry on. He works to reform himself from sunrise to sunset." "It's up to you how much time you spend with us," Spencer said. "We don't mess around with idiots here. If you mess up, we have a place for you, and you will not like it. I'll see to it personally." Spencer had a severe face, but when he touched the enormous key ring on his belt, the corners of his mouth twitched in pleasure, it seemed, or to signal a murkier emotion. The supervisor turned to Franklin, the boy who'd come back for a second taste of nickel. "Tell them, Franklin." Franklin's voice cracked, and he had to fix himself before he got out. "Yes, sir. You don't want to step over the line in here." The supervisor looked at each boy in turn, took notes in his head, and stood. "Mr. Loomis will finish processing you," he said, and walked out. The ring of keys on his belt jangled like spurs on a sheriff in a western. A sullen young white man, Loomis, appeared minutes later and led them to the basement room where they kept the school uniforms. Denim pants, gray work shirts, and brown brogues in different sizes filled shelves on the walls. Loomis told the boys to find their sizes, directing Elwood to the colored section, which contained the more threadbare items. They changed into their new clothes. Elwood folded his shirt and dungarees and put them in the canvas sack he'd brought from home. He had 2 sweaters in the bag, and his suit from the Emancipation Day play for church. Franklin and Bill hadn't brought anything with them. Elwood tried not to stare at the marks on the other boys' bodies as they dressed. Both of them had long, lumpy lines of scars and what looked like burn marks. He never saw Franklin and Bill after that day. The school had more than 600 students. The white boys went down the hill, and the black boys went up the hill. Back in the intake room, the boys waited for their housefathers to fetch them. Elwood's arrived first, a chubby, white-haired man with dark skin and gray, mirthful eyes. Where Spencer was severe and intimidating, Blakely's personality was soft and pleasant. He gave Elwood a warm handshake and told him that he was in charge of his assigned dormitory, Cleveland. They walked to the colored housing. Elwood's posture unscrewed. He was scared of a place that was run by men like Spencer and what that meant for his time there, to be under the eyes of men who liked to make threats and relished the effect of their threats on people. But perhaps the black staff looked after their own. And even if they were just as mean as the white men, Elwood had never permitted himself the kind of misbehavior that landed others in trouble. He consoled himself with the notion that he just had to keep doing what he'd always done: act right. There weren't many students out and about. Figures moved in the windows of the residential buildings. Dinner time, Elwood supposed. The few black boys who passed them on the concrete walkway greeted Blakely with respect and didn't see Elwood at all. Blakely said he'd worked at the school for 11 years, from the bad old days up to now. The school had a philosophy, he explained, in that they put the boys' fates in their own hands. You boys are in charge of everything, Blakely said. Burn the bricks in all these buildings you see here. Lay the concrete, take care of all this grass. Do a good job too, as you can see. Work keeps the boys level, he continued. Provides skills they can use when they graduate. Nichols Printing Press did all the publishing for the government of Florida, from the tax regulations to the building codes to the parking tickets. Learn how to execute those big orders and take your corner of responsibility. That's knowledge you can draw on for the rest of your life. Every boy had to attend school, Blakely said. That was a rule. Other reformatory schools might not strike that balance between reform and education, but Nichols made sure that their charges did not fall behind, with classroom instruction every other day, alternating with work details, Sundays off. The housefather noticed the change in Elwood's expression. Not what you expected. I was going to take college classes this year, Elwood said. It was October. He would have been deep into the semester. Speak to Mr. Goodall about it, Blakely said. He teaches the older students. I'm sure you can come to an arrangement. He smiled. You ever worked a field? He asked. They grew multiple crops on the 1,400 acres. Limes, sweet potatoes, watermelon. I came up on a farm, Blakely said. A lot of these kids, it's their first time taking care of anything. Yes, sir, Elwood said. There was a tag or something in his shirt. It kept sticking him in the neck. Blakely stopped. He said, You know when to say, yes, sir, which is always, you'll be okay, son. He was familiar with Elwood's situation. His intonation swaddled the word in euphemism. A lot of the boys here, they got in over their heads. This is an opportunity to take stock and get your head right. Cleveland was identical to the other dormitories on the campus. Nickel brick under a green copper roof, surrounded by box hedges that clawed out of the red soil. Blakely took Elwood through the front door, and it was swiftly clear that outside was one thing and inside another. The warped floors creaked incessantly, and the yellow walls were scuffed and scratched. Stuffing dribbled from the couches and armchairs in the recreation room. Initials and epithets marked the tables, gouged by 100 mischievous hands. Elwood fixated on the housekeeping chores Harriet would have ticked off for his attention. The fuzzy halos of finger grime around every cabinet latch and doorknob. The balls of dirt and hair in the corners. Blakely explained the layout. The first floor of each dorm was taken up by a small kitchen, the administration offices, and 2 large assembly rooms. On the second were the dorm rooms, 2 of them for the high school-age students and 1 reserved for the younger kids. We call the younger students Chucks, but don't ask me why. Nobody knows. On the top was where Blakely lived and some utility rooms. The boys were heading to bed, Blakely told him. The dining hall was a walk, and they were wrapping up supper. But did he want something from the kitchen before they closed for the night? Elwood couldn't think of food. He was too knotted up. There was an empty bed in room 2. 3 rows of bunks stretched over the blue linoleum, each row with 10 beds, each bed with a trunk at the foot for the boys' things. No one had paid Elwood any attention on the walk over, but in here, each boy took his measure. Some of them conferring quietly with their buddies as Blakely took him down the rows, and others filing away their appraisals for later. One boy looked like a 30-year-old man, but Elwood knew that was impossible since they let you out when you turned 18. Some of the boys carried themselves rough, like the white boys in the car from Tampa, but he was relieved that a lot of them looked like regular guys from his neighborhood, just sadder. If they were regular, he'd make it through. Despite what he'd heard, Nickel was indeed a school, and not a grim jail for juveniles. Elwood had gotten off lucky, his lawyer said. Stealing a car was a big-ticket offense for Nickel. He'd learn that most of the kids had been sent here for much lesser and nebulous and inexplicable offenses. Some students were wards of the state, without family, and there was nowhere else to put them. Blakely opened the trunk to show Elwood his soap and towel, and introduced him to the boys who slept on either side of him, Desmond and Pat. The housefather instructed them to show Elwood the ropes. "Don't think I won't be watching you." The two boys mumbled hello and returned to their baseball cards. Once Blakely disappeared. Elwood had never been much of a crier, but he'd taken it up since the arrest. The tears came at night, when he imagined what Nickel held in store for him, when he heard his grandmother sobbing in her room next door, fussing around, opening and closing things because she didn't know what to do with her hands, when he tried without success to figure out why his life had bent to this wretched avenue. He knew he couldn't let the boys see him weep, so he turned over in the bunk and put his pillow over his head and listened to the voices, the jokes and taunts, the stories of home and distant cronies, the juvenile conjectures about how the world worked, and their naive plans to outwit it. He'd started the day in his old life and ended it here. The pillowcase smelled like vinegar, and in the night the katydids and crickets screeched in waves, soft then loud, back and forth. Elwood was asleep when a different roar commenced. It came from outside, a rush and a whoosh without variation, forbidding and mechanical and granting no clue to its origin. He didn't know which book he'd picked it up from, but the word came to him, torrential. A voice across the room said, "Somebody's going out for ice cream," and a few boys snickered. Chapter 5. Elwood met Turner his second day at Nickel, which was also the day he discovered the grim purpose of the noise. "Most niggers last whole weeks before they go down," the boy named Turner told him later. "You got to quit that eager beaver shit, El." A bugler and his brisk reveille woke them most mornings. Blakely rapped on the door of room 2 and yelled, "Time to get up." The students saluted another morning at Nickel with groans and cussing. They lined up, 2 by 2 for attendance, and then came the 2-minute shower where the boys furiously lathered with the chalky soap before their time ran out. Elwood put on a good show of acting unsurprised by the communal showers, but had less success hiding his horror at the frigid water, which was searching and merciless. What came from the pipes smelled of rotten eggs, as did anyone who bathed in it until their skin dried. "Now it's breakfast," Desmond said. His bunk was next to Elwood's, and the boy made an effort to fulfill the house father's orders from the night before. Desmond had a round head, chubby baby cheeks, and a voice that startled everyone the first time they heard it. It was so gruff and full of bass. His voice made the Chucks jump when he crept up on them, and he got a kick out of it, until one day a supervisor with an even deeper voice crept up on him and taught him a lesson. Elwood told him his name again, to signal a new start to their acquaintance. "You told me last night," Desmond said. He laced his brown shoes, which were impeccably polished. "If you've been here a while, you're supposed to help out the grubs so you can get points. I'm halfway to Pioneer." He walked with Elwood the quarter-mile to the dining hall, but they got separated in the chow line, and when Elwood looked for a place to sit, he didn't see him. The mess hall was loud and rowdy, full of all the Cleveland boys serving up their morning round of nonsense. Elwood was invisible again. He found an empty seat at one of the long tables. When he neared, a boy slapped his hand on the bench and said it was saved. The next table over was filled with younger kids, but when Elwood put his tray down, they looked at him like he was crazy. "Big kids aren't allowed to sit at a little kid's table," one of them said. Elwood sat down quickly at the next free spot he saw, and to head off rebuke, didn't make eye contact, just ate. The oatmeal had a bunch of cinnamon dumped into it to hide a lousy taste. Elwood gobbled it down. He finished peeling his orange before he finally looked up at the boy across the table who had been staring at him. The first thing Elwood noticed was the notch in the boy's left ear, like on an alley cat that had been in scrapes. The boy said, "You eat that oatmeal like your mama made it." Who was this, talking about his mother? "What?" he said. "I didn't mean it like that. I meant I ain't never seen someone eat this food like that, like they liked it." The second thing Elwood noticed was the boy's eerie sense of self. The mess hall was loud with the rumble and roil of juvenile activity, but this boy bobbed in his own pocket of calm. Over time, Elwood saw that he was always simultaneously at home in whatever scene he found himself, and also seemed like he shouldn't have been there, inside and above at the same time, apart and apart. Like a tree trunk that falls across a creek. It doesn't belong, and then it's never not been there, generating its own ripples in the larger current. He said his name was Turner. "I'm Elwood, from Tallahassee, Frenchtown, Frenchtown." A boy down the line mimicked Elwood's voice, giving it a sissy turn, and his buddies laughed. There were 3 of them. The biggest one he'd seen last night, the boy who looked too old to attend nickel. The giant was named Griff. In addition to his mature appearance, he was broad-chested and hunched like a big brown bear. Griff's daddy, it was said, was on a chain gang in Alabama for murdering his mother, making his meanness a handed-down thing. Griff's 2 pals were Elwood's size, lean on the bone, but wild and cruel in the eyes. Lonnie's wide bulldog face tapered into a bullet at his shaved scalp. He'd scrounged up a patchy mustache and had a habit of smoothing it with his thumb and index finger when calculating brutality. The last member of the trio was called Black Mike. He was a wiry youth from Opelousas who was in constant battle with restless blood. This morning, he wobbled in his seat and sat on his hands to keep them from flying off. The 3 of them owned the other end of the table. The seats between were empty because everyone else knew better. "I don't know why you so loud, Griff," Turner said. "You knew they got their eye on you this week." Elwood assumed he meant the housemen. There were 8 of them spread out at different tables in the mess, eating with their charges. It was impossible he'd overheard, but the houseman closest to them looked up and sent everybody act casual. Griff, the bruiser, made a barking noise at Turner, and the other 2 boys laughed, the dog noises part of a running gag. The one with the shaved head, Lonnie, winked at Elwood, and then they returned to their morning meeting. "I'm from Houston myself," Turner said. He sounded bored. "That's a real city. None of this country shit y'all got up here." "Thanks for that," Elwood said. He tipped his head toward the bullies. The boy picked up his tray. "I didn't do shit." Then everyone was on their feet. Time for class. Desmond tapped Elwood on the shoulder and escorted him. The colored schoolhouse was down the hill, next to the garage and the warehouse. "I used to hate school," Desmond said. "But here, you can grab some shut-eye." "I thought this place was strict," Elwood said. "Back home, my daddy'd beat my ass if I missed a day of school. Nickel, though." Academic performance had no bearing on one's progress to graduation, Desmond explained. Teachers didn't take attendance or hand out grades. The clever kids worked on their merits. Enough merits, and you could get an early release for good behavior. Work, comportment, demonstrations of compliance, or docility, however, these things counted toward your ranking and were never far from Desmond's attention. He had to get home. He was from Gainesville, where his father had a shoe shine stand. Desmond took off so many times, raising hell, that his father begged Nickel to take him. I was sleeping under the stars so much, he thought I'd learn to appreciate having a roof over my head. Elwood asked him if it was working. Desmond turned away and said, "Man, I got to make it to Pioneer." His grown-up man's voice, coming out of his scrawny body, made it a poignant wish. The colored schoolhouse was older than the dormitories, one of the few structures that dated back to the opening of the school. There were 2 classrooms upstairs for the Chucks and 2 on the main floor for the older kids. Desmond steered Elwood into their homeroom, which had 50 desks or so crammed inside. Elwood squeezed into the second row and was swiftly appalled. The posters on the walls featured bespectacled owls hooting out the alphabet, next to bright drawings of elementary nouns: house, cat, barn, little kid stuff. Worse than the second-hand textbooks at Lincoln High, all the Nickel textbooks were from before he was born. Earlier editions of textbooks Elwood remembered from first grade. The teacher, Mr. Goodall, appeared, but no one paid him any mind. Goodall was a pink-skinned man in his mid-60s, with thick tortoiseshell eyeglasses, a linen suit, and a mane of white hair that gave him a learned air. His scholarly demeanor swiftly evaporated. Only Elwood was dismayed by the teacher's distracted, lackluster efforts. The other boys spent the morning goofing and joshing. Griff and his cronies played spades at the back of the classroom, and when Elwood caught Turner's eye, the boy was reading a wrinkled Superman comic. Turner saw him, shrugged, and turned the page. Desmond was out cold, his neck cracked at a painful angle. Elwood, who did all of Mr. Marconi's accounting in his head, took the rudimentary math lesson as an insult. He was supposed to be taking college classes. That's why he was in that car in the first place. He shared a primer with the boy next to him, a fat kid who burped up breakfast in powerful gusts, and they started a dumb game of tug-of-war. Most of the Nickel boys couldn't read. As each boy picked up that morning's story, nonsense about an industrious hare, Mr. Goodall didn't bother to correct them or share the proper pronunciation. Elwood carved each syllable with such precision that the students around him stirred from their reveries, curious as to what kind of black boy talked like that. He approached Goodall at the lunch bell, and the teacher pretended to know him. "Hello, son. What can I do for you?" Another one of his colored boys. They came and went. Up close, Goodall's pink cheeks and nose were lumpy and riddled. His sweat, accented by last night's bottle, was a sweet vapor. Elwood kept the indignation out of his voice when he asked if Nickel had advanced classes for students who were looking forward to college. He'd learned this material years ago, he explained humbly. Goodall was amiable enough. "Certainly, I'll speak to the director about it. What was your name again?" Elwood caught up with Desmond on the path back to Cleveland. He told Desmond about his conversation with the teacher. Desmond said, "You believe that shit?" After lunch, when it was time for art class and shop, Blakely pulled Elwood aside. The housefather wanted Elwood to work on the yard crew with some of the grubs. He'd be joining the other boys in the middle of their shift, but grounds work gave you the lay of the land, so to speak. "See it close up," Blakely said. That first afternoon, Elwood and 5 other boys, most of them Chucks, prowled over the colored half of campus with scythes and rakes. Their leader was a quiet-natured boy named Jamie, who had the spindly, undernourished frame common to Nickel's students. He bounced around Nickel a lot. His mother was Mexican, so they didn't know what to do with him. On his arrival, he was put in with the white kids, but his first day working in the lime fields, he got so dark that Spencer had him reassigned to the colored half. Jamie spent a month in Cleveland, but then Director Hardy toured one day, took a look at that light face among the dark faces, and had him sent back to the white camp. Spencer bided his time and tossed him back a few weeks later. "I go back and forth," Jamie said, as he raked up pine needles into a mound. He had the screwed-down smile of the rickety-toothed. "One day, they'll make up their minds, I suppose." Elwood got his tour as they cut their way up the hill, past the two other colored dormitories, the red clay basketball courts, and the big laundry building. Looking down, most of the white campus was visible through the trees, the three dormitories, the hospital, and administration buildings. The head of the school, Director Hardy, worked in the big red one with the American flag. There were the big facilities the black boys and white boys used at different times, like the gymnasium, the chapel, and the wood shop. From above, the white schoolhouse was identical to the colored one. Elwood wondered if it was in better shape, like the schools in Tallahassee, or if Nickel delivered the same stunted education to all its charges, regardless of skin color. When they got to the top of the hill, the yard crew turned around. On the other side of the rise was the graveyard, Boot Hill. A low wall of rough stones enclosed the white crosses, gray weeds, the bent and lurching trees. The boys gave it a wide berth. "If you took the road past the other side of the slope," Jamie explained, "eventually you reached the printing plant, the first set of farms, and then the swamp that marked the northern end of the property. You'll be picking potatoes sooner or later. Don't worry," he told Elwood. Gangs of students walked the trails and roads to their work assignments, while supervisors in their state cars crisscrossed the property, watching. Elwood stood in wonder at the sight of a black boy, 13 or 14 years old, driving an old tractor that pulled a wooden trailer full of students. The driver looked sleepy and serene in his big seat, taking his charges to the farm. When the other boys stiffened and stopped talking, it meant that Spencer was about. Midway between the colored and the white campuses stood a single-story rectangular building, short and skinny, that Elwood took for a storage shed. Rust stains fell like vines across the white paint, covering its concrete block walls, but the green trim around the windows and front door was fresh and bright. The longer wall had one big window with three smaller ones next to it, like ducklings. A patch of uncut grass, a foot wide, encircled the building, untouched and untamed. "Should we cut that too?" Elwood asked. The two boys next to Elwood sucked their teeth. "Nigger, you don't go that way unless they take you," one said. Elwood spent his free time before supper in Cleveland's rec room. He explored the cabinets, where they kept the cards and games and spiders. Students argued over who was next for table tennis, slapped paddles toward the saggy net, and cursed over wild shots, the pop of the white balls like the ragged heartbeat of an adolescent afternoon. Elwood checked out the meager offerings on the bookshelves, the Hardy Boys and comic books. There were moldy volumes about the natural sciences with space vistas and close-ups of the sea floor. He opened one cardboard chess set. There were only 3 pieces inside, a rook and 2 pawns. The other students circulated to or from work or sports upstairs to the bunks into their private recesses of mischief. Mr. Blakely stopped on his way through and introduced Elwood to Carter, one of the black housemen. He was younger than the house father and carried himself like a stickler. Carter gave him a quick, dubious nod and turned to tell a thumbsucker in the corner to knock it off. Half of the housemen in Cleveland were black and half were white. You got a coin toss over whether they look the other way or hassle you, Desmond said, no matter what color they are. Desmond lay on one of the couches, his head on the funny pages to prevent it from touching an unwholesome stain on the upholstery. Most are okay, but some of them got that mad dog shit in them. Desmond pointed out the student captain, whose job it was to keep track of infractions and attendance. This week, Cleveland's captain was a light-skinned boy with thick gold curls named Birdie. He was pigeon-toed. Birdie patrolled the first floor with the clipboard and pencil that were the trappings of his office, humming happily. "This one will rat on you in a second," Desmond said. "But get a good captain, and you can scrape up some nice merits for explorer or pioneer." An air horn screeched to the south, down the hill. No telling what it was. Elwood turned over a wooden crate and slumped down. Where to fit this place into the path of his life? The paint hung in thin rinds from the ceiling, and the sooty windows turned every hour overcast. He was thinking of Dr. King's speech to high school students in Washington, D.C., when he spoke of the degradations of Jim Crow and the need to transform that degradation into action. It will enrich your spirit as nothing else can. It will give you that rare sense of nobility that can only spring from love and selflessly helping your fellow man. Make a career of humanity. Make it a central part of your life. "I am stuck here, but I'll make the best of it," Elwood told himself, "and I'll make it brief." Everybody back home knew him as even dependable. Nickel would soon understand that about him too. At dinner, he'd ask Desmond how many points he needed to move out of grub, how long it took most people to advance and graduate. Then he'd do it twice as fast. This was his resistance. With that, he went through 3 chess sets, made a complete set of pieces, and won 2 games in a row. Why he intervened in the fight in the bathroom? He couldn't muster a proper answer later. It was something his grandfather might have done in one of Harriet's stories. Stepped up when he saw something wrong. The younger boy, being bullied Corey, was not someone he'd met before. The bullies he'd encountered at his breakfast table, Lonnie with his bulldog face, and his manic partner, Black Mike. Elwood went into the first-floor bathroom to urinate, and the taller boys had Corey up against the cracked tile wall. Maybe it was because Elwood didn't have any goddamn sense, as the Frenchtown boys said. Maybe it was because they were bigger and the other guy was smaller. His lawyer had persuaded the judge to let Elwood spend his last free days at home. There was no one to take him to Nickel that day, and the Tallahassee jail was overcrowded. Perhaps if he'd spent more time in the crucible of the county jail, Elwood would have known that it is best not to interfere in other people's violence, no matter the underlying facts of the incident. Elwood said, "Hey," and took a step forward. Black Mike spun around, slugged him in the jaw, and knocked him back against the sink. Another boy, a Chuck, opened the bathroom door and yelled, "Oh shit!" Phil, one of the white housemen, was making the rounds. He had a drowsy way about him and usually pretended not to see what was right in front of his face. At a young age, he had decided it was easier that way. A coin toss, as Desmond had described nickel justice. This day, Phil said, "What are you little niggers up to?" His tone was light, more curious than anything else. Interpreting the scene was not part of his job. Who was at fault? Who started it? Why? His job was to keep these colored boys in check, and today his responsibilities were not outside his grasp. He knew the names of the other boys. He asked the new boy his name. "Mr. Spencer will take this up," Phil said. He told the boys to get ready for dinner. Chapter 6. White boys bruised differently than the black boys and called it the ice cream factory because you came out with bruises of every color. The black boys called it the White House because that was its official name, and it fit and didn't need to be embellished. The White House delivered the law, and everybody obeyed. They came at 1 a.m., but woke few because it was hard to sleep when you knew they were coming, even if they weren't coming for you. The boys heard the cars grind gravel outside, the doors open, the thumping up the stairs. The hearing was seeing too, in bright strokes across the mine's canvas. The men's flashlights danced. They knew where their beds were. The bunks were only 2 feet apart, and after occasions when they grabbed the wrong ones, now they made sure beforehand. They took Lonnie and Big Mike, they took Corey, and they got Elwood too. The night visitors were Spencer and a houseman named Earl, who was big and quick, which helped when a boy broke down in one of the back rooms and had to be put back on course so they could proceed. The state cars were brown Chevys, the ones that roved the grounds all day on simple errands, but at night became harbingers. Spencer driving Lonnie and Black Mike, and Earl taking Elwood and Corey, who had been weeping all night. No one talked to Elwood at dinner, as if what was coming was catching. Some boys whispered when he passed, "What a dummy," and the bullies gave him angry looks, but mostly there was a heavy pressure of menace and unease in the dormitory that didn't end until they took the boys away. The rest of the boys relaxed then, and some were even able to dream. At lights out, Desmond whispered to Elwood that once it started, it was best not to move. The strap had a notch cut into it, and it'd snag on you and slice if you were not still. In the car over, Corey made an incantation, "I'm a hold on and be still. I'm a hold on and be still." So maybe it was true. Elwood didn't ask how many times Desmond had gone down because the boys stopped talking after that piece of advice. The White House, in its previous use, had been a work shed. They parked behind it, and Spencer and his man took them in through the back. The beating entrance, the boys called it. Passing by the road out front, you'd never look twice. Spencer quickly found the key on his enormous key ring and opened the 2 padlocks. The stench was fierce, urine and other things that had soaked into the concrete. A single naked bulb buzzed in the hallway. Spencer and Earl led them past the 2 cells to the room at the front of the building, where a line of bolted-together chairs waited and a table. Right there was the front door. Elwood thought of running. He didn't. This place was why the school had no wall or fence or barbed wire around it, why so few boys ran. It was the wall that kept them in. Spencer and Earl took Black Mike in first. Spencer said, "Thought you'd be done after last time." Earl said, "Piss himself again." The roar began, an even gale. Elwood's chair vibrated with energy. He couldn't figure out what it was, some sort of machine, but it was loud enough to cover Black Mike's screams and the smack of the strap on his body. Halfway through, Elwood started counting, on the theory that if he knew how much the other boys got, he'd know how much he'd get. Unless there was a higher system to how many each boy got. Repeat offender, instigator, bystander. No one had asked Elwood for his side of the story, that he was trying to break up the fight in the bathroom, but maybe he'd get less for stepping in. He counted up to 28 before the beating stopped, and they dragged Black Mike out to one of the cars. Corey continued to sob, and when Spencer came back, he told him to shut his fucking mouth, and they took Lonnie in for his. Lonnie got around 60. It was impossible to make out what Spencer and Earl said to him back there, but Lonnie needed more instructions or admonishments than his partner. They took Corey in for his, and Elwood noticed there was a Bible on the table. Corey got around 70. Elwood lost his place a few times, and it didn't make sense. Why did the bullies get less than the bullied? Now he had no idea what he was in for. It didn't make sense. Maybe they lost count too. Maybe there was no system at all to the violence, and no one, not the keepers nor the kept, knew what happened or why. Then it was Elwood's time. The two cells faced each other, separated by the hallway. The beating room had a bloody mattress and a naked pillow that was covered instead by the overlapping stains from all the mouths that had bit into it. Also, the gigantic industrial fan that was the source of the roaring, the sound that traveled all over campus farther than physics allowed. Its original home was the laundry. In the summer, those old machines made an inferno. But after one of the periodic reforms, where the state made up new rules about corporal punishment, someone had the bright idea to bring it in here. Splatter on the walls, where the fan had whipped up blood in its gusting. There was a weird thing to the acoustics where the fan covered the boys' screams, but right next to it, you heard the staff's instructions perfectly. Hold onto the rail and don't let go. Make a sound and you'll get more. Shut your fucking mouth, nigger. The strap was 3 feet long, with a wooden handle, and they had called it Black Beauty since before Spencer's time, although the one he held in his hand was not the original. She had to be repaired or replaced every so often. The leather slapped across the ceiling before it came down on your legs to tell you it was about to come down, and the bunk springs made noise with each blow. Elwood held onto the top of the bed and bit into the pillow, but he passed out before they were done. So when people asked later how many licks he got, he didn't know. Chapter 7. Rarely did Harriet make proper goodbyes to her loved ones. Her father died in jail after a white lady downtown accused him of not getting out of her way on the sidewalk. Bumptious contact, as Jim Crow defined it. That's how it went in the old days. He was waiting for his appointment with the judge when they found him hung in his cell. No one believed the police's story. Niggers and jail, her uncle said. Niggers and jail. 2 days prior, Harriet had waved to him across the street on her way home from school. That was her last image of him. Her big, cheerful daddy walking to his second job. Harriet's husband, Monty, got hit in the head with a chair while breaking up a scuffle at Miss Simone's. Some colored GIs from Camp Gordon Johnston in a rumble with a bunch of Tallahassee crackers over who had next on the pool table. 2 people ended up dead. One of them was her Monty, who'd stepped up to protect one of Simone's dishwashers from 3 white men. The boy still wrote Harriet letters every Christmas. He drove a taxicab in Orlando and had 3 kids. She said goodbye to her daughter, Evelyn, and her son-in-law, Percy, the night they took off. Percy's was one leave-taking in the works for years, although she hadn't foreseen that he'd take Evelyn. Percy had been too big for the town since he got back from the war. He served in the Pacific Theater, behind the lines, keeping up the supply chain. He came back evil, not because of what happened overseas, but from what he saw on his return. He loved the army and even received a commendation for a letter he wrote to his captain about inequities in the treatment of colored soldiers. Perhaps his life might have veered elsewhere if the U.S. government had opened the country to colored advancement like they opened the army. But it was one thing to allow someone to kill for you and another to let him live next door. The GI Bill fixed things pretty good for the white boys he served with, but the uniform meant different things depending who wore it. What was the point of a no-interest loan when a white bank won't let you step inside? Percy drove up to Milledgeville to visit a buddy from his unit, and some crackers started something. He'd stopped for gas in one of those little towns. Cracker Town, Crack Your Head Town. He barely got out. Everybody knew white boys were lynching black men in uniform, but he never believed he'd be a target. Not him. Bunch of white boys jealous that they didn't have a uniform and afraid of a world that let a nigger wear one in the first place. Evelyn married him. She was always going to, since they were small. Elwood's arrival did nothing to still Percy's wildness. The corn whiskey and roadhouse nights, the roguish element he brought into their house on Brevard Street. Evelyn had never been very strong. When Percy was around, she shrank to an appendage of his, an extra arm or a leg, a mouth. He had Evelyn tell Harriet that they were leaving for California to try their luck. "What kind of people leave for California in the middle of the night?" Harriet asked. "I got to meet someone about an opportunity," Percy said. Harriet thought they should wake the boy. "Let him sleep," Evelyn said, and that was the last she heard from them. If her daughter had ever been suited for motherhood, she never demonstrated it. The look on her face when little Elwood suckled on her breast, her joyless, empty eyes seeing through the walls of the house and into pure nothing, chilled Harriet to the bone whenever she remembered it. The day the court officer came for Elwood was the worst goodbye. It had been the two of them for so long. She and Mr. Marconi would make sure the lawyer kept on fixing his case, she said. Mr. Andrews was from Atlanta, a brand of young white crusader who went north to get his law degree and came back changed. Harriet never let him go without a bite to eat. He was extravagant with his praise for her cobbler and in his optimism over Elwood's prospects. They'd find a way out of this mess of thorns, she told her grandson, and promised to visit his first Sunday at Nickel. But when she showed up, they told her that he was sick and couldn't have visitors. She asked what was wrong with him. The Nickel man said, "How the hell should I know, lady?" There was a new pair of denim pants on the chair next to Elwood's hospital bed. The beating had embedded bits of the first into his skin, and it took 2 hours for the doctor to remove the fibers. It was a duty the doctor had to perform from time to time. Tweezers did the trick. The boy would be in the hospital until he walked without pain. Dr. Cook had an office next to the examination rooms where he smoked cigars and harangued his wife on the telephone all day, bickering over money or her no-account relatives. The potatoey cigar smoke permeated the ward, covering the smell of sweat and vomit and gamey skin, and dissipated by dawn, when he'd show up and perfume the place again. There was a glass case full of bottles and boxes of medicine that he unlocked with great seriousness, but he only ever reached for the big bucket of aspirin. Elwood spent his stay on his stomach, for obvious reasons. The hospital inducted him into its rhythms. Nurse Wilma grunted around most days, hale and brusque, slamming drawers and cabinets. She kept her hair in a licorice red bouffant and dotted her cheeks with rouge so that she reminded Elwood of a haunted doll come to hideous life, something out of horror comics. The Crypt of Terror, the Vault of Horror, read by window light in his cousin's attic. Horror comics, he'd noticed, delivered two kinds of punishment: completely undeserved and sinister justice for the wicked. He placed his current misfortune in the former category and waited to turn the page. Nurse Wilma was almost sweet to the white boys who came in with their abrasions and ailments, a second mother. Nary a kind word for the black boys. Elwood's bedpan was a particular affront. She looked as if he'd pissed in her outstretched palms. More than once in his protest dreams, hers was the face of the waitress behind the counter who refused to serve him. The housewife with the spit-flecked mouth, cursing like a sailor. That he dreamed of a time when he was outside and marching kept his spirits up each morning when he woke in the hospital, his mind still capable of travel. That first day, there was only one other boy in the hospital, his bed hidden behind a folding curtain at the far end of the ward. When Nurse Wilmer or Dr. Cook tended to him, they closed it behind them, the wheels of the curtain squeaking across the white tile. The patient never spoke when the staff addressed him, but their voices had a cheerful quality that was absent when they talked to the other boys. The kid was a terminal case or royalty. None of the students who stayed on the ward knew who he was or what landed him there. The cast of boys came in and out. Elwood got to know some white kids he wouldn't have met otherwise. Wards of the state, orphans, runaways who'd lit out to get away from mothers who entertained men for money or to escape rummy fathers who came into their rooms in the middle of the night. Some of them were rough characters. They stole money, cussed at their teachers, damaged public property, had stories about bloody pool hall fights, and uncles who sold moonshine. They were sent to Nickel for offences Elwood had never heard of: malingering, mopery, incorrigibility. Words the boys didn't understand either. But what was the point when their meaning was clear enough? Nickel. I got busted for sleeping in a garage to keep warm. I stole $5 from my teacher. I drank a bottle of cough syrup and went wild one night. I was on my own trying to get by. Wow, they got you good, Dr. Cook said whenever he changed Elwood's dressings. Elwood didn't want to look, but he had to. He got a glimpse of his inner thighs, where the raw slashes on the backs of his legs crept up like gruesome fingers. Dr. Cook gave him an aspirin and retreated to his office. 5 minutes later, he was arguing with his wife over a shiftless cousin who needed a loan for a scheme. Some snuffling dude woke Elwood in the middle of the night, and he was up for hours, his skin burning and wriggling under the bandages. A week into his hospital stay, he opened his eyes and Turner lay in the bed opposite, whistling the theme to the Andy Griffith Show, cheerful and fluttering. He was a good whistler, and for the remainder of their friendship, his performances provided a score, capturing the mood of the escapade or fluting a countervailing commentary. Turner waited until Nurse Wilmer went outside for a cigarette and explained his visit. "Thought I'd take me a vacation," he said. He'd eaten some soap powder to make himself sick, an hour of stomachache for a whole day off. Or two, he knew how to sell it. "Got some more powder hidden in my sock too," he said. Elwood turned away to brood. "How you like that witch doctor?" Turner asked later. Dr. Cook had just taken the temperature of a white boy down the row who was puffed up and moaning like a cow. The phone rang. The doctor dropped 2 aspirin into the white kid's palm and hoofed it to his office. Turner rolled up to Elwood. He was clackety-clacking around the ward in one of the old polio wheelchairs. He said, "Come in here with your damn head cut off," and he'd give you aspirin. Elwood didn't want to chuckle, like it would be cheating on his pain, but he couldn't help it. His testicles were swole up from where the strap landed between his legs, and his laughter tugged something inside and made them hurt again. "Nigger come in here," Turner said. "Head cut off, both legs, both arms cut off, and that fucking witch doctor would be like, 'You want 1 tablet or 2? He coaxed the stuck wheels of the wheelchair and huffed away. There was nothing to read apart from the Gator, the school newspaper, and a pamphlet commemorating the school's 50th anniversary, both printed on the other side of campus by Nickel students. Every boy in every picture was smiling, but even after Elwood's short stay, he recognized a kind of Nickel deadness in their eyes. He suspected he had it too, now that he had fully enrolled. Turning slowly on his side, propped on an elbow, he went through the pamphlet a few times. The state opened the school in 1899 as the Florida Industrial School for Boys, a reform school where the young offender of law, separated from vicious associates, may receive physical, intellectual, and moral training. be reformed and restored to the community with purpose and character fitting for a good citizen, an honorable and an honest man with a trade or skilled occupation fitting such person for self-maintenance. The boys were called students rather than inmates to distinguish them from the violent offenders that populated prisons. All the violent offenders, Elwood added, were on staff. When it opened, the school admitted children as young as 5, a fact that swept up Elwood in a lament when he tried to sleep. All those helpless kids. The first 1,000 acres were granted by the state. Over the years, locals generously donated another 400. Nickel earned its keep. The construction of the printing plant was a bona fide success by any measure. In 1926 alone, publishing created a profit of $250,000, in addition to introducing the students to a useful trade in which to apply themselves after graduation. The brickmaking machine produced 20,000 bricks a day. Its issue propped up buildings all over Jackson County, big and small. The school's annual Christmas light display, designed and executed by the students, drew visitors from miles around. Every year, the newspaper sent out a reporter. In 1949, the year of the pamphlet's publication, the school was renamed in honor of Trevor Nickel, a reformer who'd taken over a few years earlier. The boys used to say it was because their lives weren't worth 5 cents, but it was not the case. Occasionally, you passed Trevor Nickel's portrait in the hallway, and he frowned like he knew what you were thinking. No, that wasn't it. Like he knew you knew what he was thinking. The next time one of the Ringworm boys came in from Cleveland, Elwood asked the kid to bring back some books for him to read, and he did. Plopped down a stack of battered natural science books that by accident provided a course in ancient forces, tectonic collisions, mountain ranges thrown up to the sky, volcanic bombast, all the violence roiling beneath that makes the world above. They were big books with exuberant pictures, red and orange, in contrast with the cloudy, white-gone grey of the ward. Turner's second day in the hospital, Elwood caught him pulling a piece of folded cardboard out of his sock. Turner swallowed the contents, and an hour later, he was hollering. Dr. Cook came out, and he threw up on the man's shoes. "I told you not to eat the food," Dr. Cook said. "It's going to make you sick, what they serve here." "What else am I supposed to eat, Mr. Cook?" The doctor blinked. When Turner finished mopping up the vomit, Elwood said, "Doesn't that hurt your stomach?" "Sure it does, man," Turner said. "But I don't feel like going to work today. These beds are lumpy as hell, but you can get some good shut-eye. You figure out how to lay on them." The secret boy behind the folded curtain made a heavy sigh, and Elwood and Turner jumped. He didn't make much noise as a rule, and you forgot he was around. "Hey," Elwood said. "You over there." "Shh," went Turner. There was no sound, not even the shifting of a blanket. "You go look," Elwood said. Something had settled. He felt better today. "See who it is. Ask what's wrong with him." Turner looked at him like he was nuts. "I ain't asking nobody shit." "Scared?" Elwood said, like one of the boys from his street, how buddies taunted each other back home. "Damn," Turner said. "You don't know. Pop back there for a look. Maybe you have to trade places with him, like in a ghost story." That night, Nurse Wilmer stayed late, reading to the kid behind the curtain. The Bible, a hymn, it sounded how people sound when they have God in their mouth. The beds were occupied, and then they weren't. A bad batch of canned peaches filled the ward. There weren't enough beds, so they slept head to toe, gassy and gurgling. The beds turned over. Grubs, explorers, and the industrious pioneers. Injured, infected, faking it, and afflicted. spider bite, busted ankle, lost a fingertip in a loading machine, a visit to the White House. Knowing that he'd gone down, the other boys no longer kept him at a distance. He was one of them now. Elwood got sick of looking at his new pants sitting there on the chair. He folded them up and stuffed them under his mattress. The big radio over by Dr. Cook's office played all day, competing with the noise of the metal shop next door. Electric saws, steel on steel. The doctor thought the radio was therapeutic. Nurse Wilma saw no reason to coddle the boys. Don McNeil's Breakfast Club, preachers and cereals, the soaps Elwood's grandmother listened to. The problems of the white people in radio shows had been remote, belonging to another country. Now, they were a ride home to Frenchtown. Elwood hadn't heard Amos and Andy in years. His grandmother turned off the radio when Amos and Andy came on, with its carousel of malapropisms and demeaning misadventures. White people like that stuff, but we don't have to listen to it. She was glad when she read, in the Defender, that it had been taken off the air. A station around Nickel broadcast old episodes, haunted transmissions. No one touched the dial when the old reruns came on, and everyone laughed at Amos and Kingfisher's antics, black boys and white boys alike. Holy mackerel! One of the radio stations sometimes played the theme to the Andy Griffith Show, and Turner whistled in accompaniment. "Aren't you worried they'll know you're faking it?" Elwood said. "Whistling happy like that?" "I ain't faking. That soap powder is awful," Turner said. "But it's me choosing, not anyone else." That was a dumb way of looking at it, but Elwood didn't say anything. The theme music was stuck in his head now, and Elwood would have hummed or whistled, but he didn't want to look like a copycat. The song was a tiny, quiet piece of America carved out of the rest. No fire hoses, no need for the National Guard. It occurred to Elwood that he'd never seen a Negro in the small town of Mayberry where the show took place. A man on the radio announced that Sonny Liston was going to fight an up-and-comer named Cassius Clay. "Who's that?" Elwood said. "Some nigger, about to get knocked down," Turner said. One afternoon, Elwood was half dozing when the noise paralyzed him. The keys like a wind chime. Spencer was on the ward to see the doctor. Elwood waited for the sound of the leather strap scraping the ceiling before it came down. Then, the superintendent was gone, and the sound of the radio commanded the room again. He sweat through to his sheets. "Do they do it like that to everybody?" Elwood asked Turner after lunch. Nurse Wilma had distributed ham sandwiches and watery grape juice. White kids first. Out of the blue, but Turner knew what Elwood was referring to. He rolled over in the polio chair, lunch in his lap. "Not like what you got," he said. "Not that bad. I've never gone down. I got smacked across the face for smoking once." "I have a lawyer," Elwood said. "He can do something." "You already got off lucky," Turner said. "How come?" Turner finished his juice with a slurp. "Sometimes they take you to the White House, and we never see your ass again." It was quiet on the ward, except for them, and the buzz saw next door, keening. Elwood didn't want to know, but he asked anyway. "Your family asked the school what happened, and they say you ran away," Turner said. He made sure the white boys weren't looking. "Problem was, Elwood," he said, "you didn't know how it works. Take Corey and those two cats. You wanted to do some Lone Ranger shit, run up and save a nigger. But they punked him out a long time ago. See, those three do that all the time. Corey likes it. They play rough, then he takes them into the stall or whatever and gets on his knees. That's how they do." "I saw his face. He was scared," Elwood said. "You don't know what makes him tick," Turner said. "You don't know what makes anybody tick. I used to think out there is out there, and then once you're in here, you're in here. that everybody in Nickel was different because of what being here does to you. Spencer and them too. Maybe out there in the free world, they're good people, smiling, nice to their kids. His mouth squinched up, like he was sucking on a rotten tooth. But now that I've been out and I've been brought back, I know there's nothing in here that changes people. In here and out there are the same, but in here, no one has to act fake anymore. He was talking in circles, everything pointing back at itself. Elwood said, "It's against the law. State law, but also Elwood's. If everyone looked the other way, then everybody was in on it. If he looked the other way, he was as implicated as the rest." That's how he saw it, how he'd always seen things. Turner didn't say anything. "It's not how it's supposed to be," Elwood said. "Don't nobody care about supposed to. If you call out Black Mike and Lonnie, you calling out everyone who lets it happen too. You ratting on everybody. That's what I'm telling you." Elwood told Turner about his grandmother and the lawyer, Mr. Andrews. They'd report Spencer and Earl and anybody else up to no good. His teacher, Mr. Hill, was an activist. He'd marched all over. He hadn't returned to Lincoln High School after the summer because he was back organizing. Elwood wrote him about his arrest, but wasn't sure if he got the letter. Mr. Hill knew people who'd want to know about a place like Nickel once they got a hold of him. "It's not like the old days," Elwood said. "We can stand up for ourselves. That shit barely works out there. What do you think it's going to do in here?" "You say that because there's no one else out there sticking up for you." "That's true," Turner said. "That doesn't mean I can't see how it works. Maybe I see things more clearly because of it." He made a face as the soap powder gave him a kick. "The key to in here is the same as surviving out there. You got to see how people act, and then you got to figure out how to get around them like an obstacle course. If you want to walk out of here, graduate." "Walk out of here," Turner corrected. "You think you can do that? Watch and think? Nobody else is going to get you out. Just you." Dr. Cook gave Turner the boot the next morning with 2 aspirin and a repeat of his prescription that he not eat the food. It was only Elwood on the ward then. The curtain that had been around the nameless boy was in the corner, folded flat into itself. The bed was empty. He disappeared sometime in the night without waking anyone. Elwood intended to follow Turner's advice, and he meant it, but that was before he saw his legs. That defeated him for a spell. He spent another 5 days in the hospital. Then it was back with the other Nickel boys. School and work. He was one of them now, in many ways, including his embrace of silence. When his grandmother came to visit, he couldn't tell her what he saw when Dr. Cook removed the dressings and he walked the cold tile to the bathroom. Elwood got a look at himself then and knew that her heart wouldn't be able to take it, plus his shame in letting it happen. He was as far away from her as the others in her family who'd vanished, and he was sitting right in front of her. On visiting day, he told her he was okay, but sad. It was difficult, but he was hanging in there, when all he wanted to say was, "Look at what they did to me. Look at what they did to me." Chapter 8. When Elwood got out, he returned to the yard crew. Jamie the Mexican had been chucked to the white side again, so another boy was in charge. More than once, Elwood caught himself swinging the scythe with too much violence, like he was attacking the grass with a leather strap. He'd stop and tell his heart to slow down. 10 days later, Jamie was back with the colored boys. Spencer rooted him out, but he didn't mind. That's my life, ping pong. Elwood's schooling was not going to improve. He had to accept that. He touched Mr. Goodall's arm outside the schoolhouse. The teacher didn't recognize him. Goodall repeated his promise to find more challenging work. But Elwood was on to the teacher now and didn't ask again. One late November afternoon, they sent Elwood with a team to clean out the basement of the schoolhouse, and he found a set of Chipwick's British classics underneath some boxes containing calendars for 1954. Trollope and Dickens and people with names like that.